paper on bioelectric networks being the cognitive glue for organisms. And then Darwin's Agential Materials. That'll be the second paper we cover. And then finally, Biology, Buddhism, AI, your paper with collaborators that I think will be the third conversation, the third act of our conversations today. So we get started off on the bioelectric networks, the cognitive glue enabling evolutionary scaling from physiology to mind, your paper. Would you be able to provide us with a brief high-level summary of the paper and what's covered here?
Yeah, well, I guess the first thing to do is to talk about what cognitive glue is and why such a thing is needed. And
Sure.
I basically I use that term just to kind of draw attention to the following thing. We often people think about collective intelligences as flocks of birds or ant colonies or termites or bees or something like that. And they contrast that sharply with themselves. They feel, well, I'm not a colony. I'm a unified individual with my own, thoughts and goals and all of that. But actually, if you sort of look inside, what you find is that no, actually, you are a colony. Like each of us is a collection of cells, neurons, and a whole bunch of other stuff. And that, and I want to emphasize this idea that that is not to be taken for granted. You cannot take for granted. It's actually kind of a miracle, not in the sort of religious sense, but in the scientific sense of something really profound that needs understanding and explanation. It's kind of a miracle that a collection of individual cells with their own agendas and their own ability to pursue various goals in physiological space and gene expression space and so on, that there is a way to arrange those things that gives rise to this emergent new self that operates in a different problem space, and in fact will end up denying the fact that it is made up of parts with their own agendas. I mean, that's kind of wild.
That's interesting, yeah.
Right? And and has its own goals, where some of these goals are often at odds with the goals of the parts, and we often do things that aren't particularly good for certain cells in the body and so on, right? Or even certain organs. So that's it right there. That it's very clear that there must be a mechanism for doing that, for transitioning from just a pile of cells to something with its own with its own self. And we can sort of define. We can do a little bit of definition there too if you want. But so that's the goal, right? So now even though people don't think about that very much, like that. The reality is that, of course, the whole field of neuroscience is predicated on the fact that we know what the cognitive glue is for behavior in the brain. It's electrical signaling and let's say electrochemical signaling in the brain. So that's the idea. And my point in this paper and in some previous papers is that there's a reason why bioelectrical signaling is so good at this in the brain. It's because it's had lots of practice evolutionarily. Where this all comes from is by serving as cognitive glue for a morphogenetic agent, which is the thing that arises when a bunch of individual cells in an embryonic blastoderm suddenly start to cooperate toward a very specific goal. They're all going on a journey in this anatomical space of possible configurations, of possible shapes that anything can be. They're all committed to helping each other get to one particular region of that space that corresponds to the target morphology of that species. And so that's what this paper is about. It's about how bioelectricity serves as that kind of cognitive glue, and then evolution kind of pivoted it to do the same thing in three-dimensional space for the control of behavior.
How did you land on the term cognitive glue? Like, were there any other turns of phrases that you were kind of deciding between?
For that one, I mean, I don't know. I use a lot of kind of these kind of terms that I just sort of come up with, but for that one, I'm not sure if there were any competitive. I mean, you can think about some sort of binding policies. You can call it some sort of an emergence, a self-emergence mechanism. I mean, you can come up with it, but I just thought it was simpler to point out that it literally is a kind of cognitive glue, because without it, think about what happens during general anesthesia, right? So you walk into the doctor, and there you are, and you have all kinds of thoughts and hopes about what happens, and you say, boy, I hope the surgery goes well. I've got a big thing I got to do a month from now. and then the gas comes in, and one of the things that happens is the gap junctions between your cells get inhibited. So now you're gone for the next however many hours. You're not there. Your cells are still there. All the pieces are still there. Nobody's damaged. Nobody's dead. The cells are all, the cells are all functional, but you're gone. And one reason you're gone is because that cognitive glue has been temporarily dissolved. It's there really needs to be something that binds all this together. And glue, it's kind of silly because it's not that physical kind of thing. But this idea that everybody has to be kept together, and the way that glue does, in a particular space. It's not just physical proximity. The cells stay close to each other. It's a kind of informational proximity. And actually, people like Giulio Tononi and others actually study this study that integration from an informational perspective. But that's really what's needed, is a mechanism to hold together the cognitive system that is then going to make claims about itself being a separate agent from the parts that make it up.
One very specific question I had in the paper, and it may have been in there, but maybe I just potentially missed it. But there's a quote in there, if you don't mind me just reading it off here.
Sure.
It's developmental bioelectricity as a precursor of brain-like processes, which reveals not only evolutionary pivots between two different problem spaces, but also shows a path to solving the problem of collective intelligence across scales of organization. What are the two different problem spaces? And perhaps it's just an example being made there, but I think there's a mention here of evolutionary pivots. Can you give the audience an example of what you mean by that?
Sure. Well, so first let's name some problem spaces here, just kind of roughly in order from the beginning of life. So you've got you've got the space of metabolism. That's a problem space because you have to figure out how to keep, if you're going to persist in the world, you have to figure out how to operate metabolism. And then there'll be some sort of physiological problem space where, aside from metabolism, you have other physiological features that you're trying to upkeep. And then at some point you get a transcriptional space where there's actually genes now that can be expressed. And so that space, very high dimensional space of the correct gene expression for whatever you need to be doing at the moment. And then when you get to multicellularity, there's an anatomical morphospace. How many eyes are you supposed to have? Are you supposed to have eyes? Where's the head go? Where's the tail go? Those kind of things. So that's the space that's an anatomical space. And then after that, you get to behavioral space, because eventually you develop muscles and nerves, and now you can actually move around in three-dimensional space. And so now you can do what's classically known as behavior. All these other things are behavior too. They're just behavior in weird spaces that we don't normally think about. And then maybe if you're some sort of human or something else, you might also operate in linguistic space. So we actually have a project now looking at navigation of linguistic space as exactly that kind of navigational process.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. And maintaining, this idea. So there's one central concept to all of this, which is navigation. This idea that the space is rich, it has structure. You as an agent have various kinds of preferences about which parts of that space are better for you and which parts are worse. And therefore you need to navigate it. Now, you have different degrees of competency of navigating it. You might navigate it the way that a bowling ball or a dandelion seed might, which is you have very little internal control, if any, of what happens. Or you might be some sort of something in between. There's various seeds with little corkscrews and things that kind of help them do various simple things. You might be some kind of a simple homeostatic agent, like a little thermostat that's actually better than these other things. Or you might actually be a learning system that can have anticipation and associative learning and things like that. Or you might be really complex and you might have planning and you might be able to really think forward pretty well. And then you might be really complex and have a gigantic cognitive light cone where you can sort of imagine lots of complex things far into the future, way outside of your current scenario. So anywhere along that continuum, there's you might have some competencies, right? And you navigate that those spaces. And so what I mean by evolutionary pivots is simply that once you're good at navigating one kind of space, it's relatively, I think this is all kind of the framework that I work on. So lots of things we don't know yet, but I think it's relatively easy for evolution to switch spaces on you, because if you're good at navigating a particular kind of space, we can swap some sensors and some effectors, and and you can use all the competencies you have to navigate some other space. So just for example, um, hybrids, right? Hybrids are when you take a brain and you put it in a robotic body, such as a vehicle. And so in that case, the brain, instead of leg muscles, might be connected to some wheels, and instead of eyes, it might have some photo arrays. And if the brain is good at doing these things, it will. And then so people have made these things, and they have various behaviors. And it sounds kind of crazy and wild, except that is the normal scenario. You see, your brain doesn't actually interface with reality. Your brain interfaces with your eyes and your muscles and various things. And all of this is highly plastic. When we've made tadpoles where the eye is on its tail instead of in the head. Those animals can see perfectly well immediately. They don't require new evolutionary adaptation, periods of evolutionary adaptation. They can just see in this new configuration. And that's because, and the same reason why sensory augmentation and sensory substitution. So this has been known since at least the 70s, probably before that, that you can do all kinds of, you can give humans all kinds of weird sensors and effectors, and they very quickly become part of them. So they become, for example, Baki Rita in the 70s used to do this thing where it's like, that toy, I don't know what it's called, but it's like the square thing with a bunch of metal nails, and you put your hand on it, and it kind of makes the imprint, right? So you can imagine an inverse of that, where the little pegs move in and out. So you take that thing and you put each peg, you connect each peg to a pixel on a camera that you wear on top of your head, and then you take that thing and you put it up against your belly so that it's poking you based on each pixel. That nail is poking you or not, right? And so he did experiments with people who are blind, who learn to navigate that way, because you can remap the information that you're getting through your skin. Because the plasticity is incredible. Look at the rubber hand illusion. You can see these videos right online where you've had as a tetrapod, your brain has known how many hands you have for how many millions of years now. And within 7 minutes of this visual input of somebody stroking this rubber hand, you've now decided that you have 3 hands. You're perfectly willing to abandon that prior. And when somebody hammers the rubber hand, people jump up and scream. And so the plasticity is incredible. And that's why when people get prosthetics where the wrist goes 360 degrees around, when they reach for a cup, they'll rotate the way that your normal wrist never rotates, because they get used to it. That's your body now. And so all of these things, this kind of plasticity. So that's why I think evolution fundamentally makes these kinds of systems that they kind of figure out what they are on the fly, sort of like Josh Bongard's robots from 2006 or so, when he made these robots that didn't have a predetermined model of what they were and where the effectors were and where the sensors were, and they sort of flopped around like babies. They flopped around until eventually they figured out how to move around, because they built a model of themselves and what their structure was. And that has the awesome side effect that if you rip off one of the legs, it'll just go through a similar process and remap to the new, and then move in a different way given what you have now. This is exactly what we see in biology, where with a very, very wide range of various accommodations to novel circumstances can be had, because evolution makes these problem-solving machines that are very good at defining and redefining themselves on the fly. So that's what I mean, right? These tricks that work well in one world, swap some stuff around, swap a time scale, swap the senses, swap the effectors, and now you're walking around in some other kind of space. I have a feeling that that's what's happening. That's my guess.